Your game's art will affect how good your game looks and whether it appeals to people. But more than that, it also affects game design and mechanics design, because at the end of the day, your game's art is a means to communicate information to the player. And if you do it well, your game will play better. However you design your enemies, platforms, and UI will tell the player how to interact with the game. And when you do it poorly, the player will feel confused and annoyed. So that's what we're talking about in this video. More specifically, we're only talking about game art in relation to combat or enemies. And we'll cover lots of games. I'll bash some and praise others. For the most part, I actually like quite a lot of these games. The first thing we'll cover is how you can use game art to convey the rules and mechanics of the game. One method of doing this is to build on established tropes and concepts that exist in other games. So let's start by looking at the first encounter you have with an enemy in Hollow Knight. The first enemy you encounter is this bug. The absolute first thing about it is to note how it looks. If you play a lot of games, such as Ori, you might instinctively think that this is an enemy that follows a set path. And if you jump over it when you first encounter it, you'll notice that it continues and keeps going forward. Your second encounter with it, you'll see that he avoids edges and just walks back. So Team Cherry has offered you quite a bit of information about the rules of this specific enemy, and you'll attach that to this specific character. They encounter these flying things, and these chase you. How do you learn this? Right before they chase you, they have a small shout animation, and then they fly towards you. That small shout is a really good signal to add before any chase. And if you do it consistently for all characters, the player will immediately know that this type of character won't chase you, because it didn't have a signal. So whenever you have a rule or mechanic of a character, establishing that to the player and giving them that information will really help them flow with the game. We can see that for these enemies as well, which when you first see them, they look like they're just patrolling. But as soon as you walk close enough, they raise their hands and start chasing you. And you know they chase you because they raise their hands. So it obviously doesn't need to be raising their hands. It can fit sort of in a game like Have a Nice Death, where there are a lot of dead characters and it's sort of zombie-like. But the main benefit of it is really that you signal to the player, this character chases you, and this don't. And you don't need to memorize it, you feel it every time you encounter it. With all of that said, I think we should actually look at what happens for the player when they play. They see what is on screen and try and interpret it, but really they make assumptions based on what they see. This means that tiny differences in your art can either help the player understand the game better, or accidentally make them misunderstand the rules of the game. To give an example of this done quite well, let's look at Rogue Legacy. You have these red fireballs that fly towards you. You can stand behind a platform to block this ball. But then there are other projectiles that fly straight through the walls. But these projectiles are always blue. It's a slightly different mechanic, and we changed the art slightly. It's a tiny design choice, and it won't make your game good, but your first reaction to seeing a blue ball after having seen a red ball before will be that it will work differently compared to the red one, because it looks different. And then you see it going through a wall, and now you know what the rule is. They first indicated this has a different rule, and then you try and test for what the difference of the rule is. If this other type of projectile that went through walls was also red, then you would most likely take damage from it on its first encounter and feel that the game is unfair. Even further than that, you might actually take damage from it several times, because you'll get confused on which projectiles go through walls and which don't, because there would be no clear identifier. So it's not only about establishing the rules, it's also about helping the player remember the rules. If you don't have enough clear identifiers, the player might feel that there's something wrong with the game. They might not be able to pinpoint what, but it will be sort of a death by 1,000 cuts. It won't feel like a polished game. I've actually mentioned something similar in how the readability in Eternal Noctis is bad, where I mentioned that the projectiles and the particle effects have the same color, and thus blend together. In this case, there isn't any difficulty in understanding the rule, because the ones that do damage do have these small eyes on them. The problem is that when you play, you want to go with the flow, and when two things that have very different rules look similar, it can be easy to make a misplay if you don't focus. So every design choice you make is important and will affect the gameplay. It isn't just about it looking good. For instance, these bugs are very similar in how they function to these, except these ones will climb around every platform instead of patrolling back and forth. Designing them essentially the same, but with just a small shift in color, will inform the player two things at the same time. First, that the enemy is quite similar to the previous one. And second, you can expect a small change. The other bonus is that it enables you to make several different types of enemies without having to redesign each and every enemy. So it's essentially a win-win. And we'll see this in plenty of games. Ori has the same thing with these critters. First you encounter this one, you learn its rules and its functions. Then you encounter this one, and it feels a bit fresh and new, but you still know kind of what to expect. So now we kind of know why we might want to think about how we design our enemies. But how explicit with your design should you be? Let's look at two games with quite similar enemies. In Momodora you have this type of enemy. and in Dead Cells you have this one. Both enemies have shields, and as a general gaming trope, we will expect that something with a shield will block your damage. And this is true for both of them. But in Momodora, the fact that the shield is held to the side instead of the front, it does not really signal when and where you can hit it. Compare that to Dead Cells, and the fact that the shield is always held towards you signals to you that you need to roll through him and hit him from the back. So what happens in Momodora is that you can have to roll and guess, and you'll assume that you did something correct. But you still might not be entirely sure what exactly to do. So we can sometimes actually encounter these small things where we actually do communicate the correct thing. But because we aren't doing it extremely clearly, it can be easy to learn the wrong rule or not quite understand what the rule actually is. Several enemies in Have a Nice Death do this explicit communication really well. Whenever they plan to attack you, you get an exclamation point above their head. And things that attack you from afar still have very clear signaling and anticipation. And things that won't move, like these hands, show that they aren't likely to move by virtue of being stuck in the ground. If you attack enemies, they sometimes get stars above their heads, showing you that they are dazed, and that you can continue attacking them. We could argue that this type of overly clear communication reduces immersion, but even if you don't want to be this blatant, you should still be aware of what your design communicates. And in Have a Nice Death, the exclamation point here isn't that necessary. But we can look at an example in Iconoclast where the exclamation point actually kind of is necessary. You have a hidden attack, but right before it comes, you get an exclamation above it, and then you know that you need to move. If this type of communication was lacking, it would make the game more challenging and difficult, but in a way that feels annoying and unfair. And I would argue that making something difficult is only valuable if it's actually challenging. And if it feels unfair, the difficulty is kind of bad. We don't need to make it this explicit either. I would argue that several enemies in Ori aren't super easy on their first encounter, but they still signal in their animation that they're attacking. And bigger enemies also have more inertia, which is what the player expects. And they even still signal small things, such as this enemy popping out from the ground before it attacks you, without feeling too explicit. But something I think we should be really careful of is communicating the wrong thing. This is one of the first enemies you encounter in Dust and Elysian Tale. Can you guess the attack pattern of this enemy? It has a spear, so naturally it will attack you from a distance. And we unpause, and it leaps towards you. How about this one? It has a big club. Naturally it will lift its club above its head and then attack you. And instead it hits you very quickly from below. This won't be the end of the world, but first impressions matter. A spear is a long distance weapon, so a player will assume that that weapon will be used long distance. A club is a heavy weapon, so the player will assume that it's an attack that is easy to dodge, but does a lot of damage. Let's look at Have a Nice Death again. This is exactly the design. A heavy big dude, you walk up to him, you get an exclamation point above its head, signaling he's about to attack, big anticipation, and then he goes. It is blatant, but it will never feel unfair. If you take damage from it, you'll be blaming yourself and not feel annoyed about the game. But if you get hit by this enemy in Dust, you might feel a bit tricked, in a bad way, as if the game hit you with a cheap shot. The same way falling debris in games often feels unfair. I'll just make a small note here and say that a portion of this communication will be important for distinguishing between friendly NPCs and enemies. Some tricks to ensure that the player understands that it is an NPC is to add calm music, add a sign or a house next to the character, make the design look friendly, and quite a lot of games even differentiate further and make it so that all friendly NPCs are the same race, or that they're humanoid. If you make all friendly NPCs also carry a signifier, the player might be unsure on the first encounter, but not on any subsequent ones. In general, I don't think this type of error is actually the end of the world, even if you get it wrong. If the player thinks an NPC is an enemy, the worst thing that can happen is that they will try and hit it and fail. It's bad communication, but it's not annoying, and frankly it's the annoyance that we want to avoid. As a last point, I want to mention this enemy in the absolute first level of Rayman, where you have these onion enemies with eyes pointing out of the ground, and they start hiding as soon as you get close. The fact that it hides when you get close makes you inclined to see if you can attack it somehow, because it reacts to you, and sure enough, you hit down and you punch it. It also adds extra text informing you that this is a type of attack, but I'm certain that a lot of players wouldn't even need this text. It tells you that it can be interacted with, and your curiosity will make it so that you try and figure out how. So with all of that said, how do you actually figure out how to do this type of communication? I just mentioned a lot of the games that do it well, but how would you know if you're doing it poorly? The first thing is to look at what you have already done and imagine what the player first seeing it would think. Frankly, a lot of my analysis in this video is just me playing a lot of games and noticing what bugs me about them or things that I felt were really cool. So trying to replicate that analysis for your own game is really important. The second thing you should do is to get someone who has never played or seen your game before and have them play it. Normally when you ask someone to play your game, you ask it for them to give you feedback. But that is not what you should do in regards to this. The important thing here is to literally watch them play. See them try and figure your game out. You will immediately see oversights you made, or your friend completely missing what you thought was obvious. If you meet an NPC and you see your friend approach it as if it is an enemy, then you know that you should go back and make it look even more friendly. So you watch them play and you take notes. Then you might as well ask them what they think, but people will often give more generic feedback, like it looks good or it plays well. And that isn't enough to fix these type of things. So watching them misunderstand what you thought was obvious can really help polish the small kinks and details that you would have otherwise missed. I'm gonna make 2 similar videos to this one regarding UI and one regarding combat. And they should be here. Thanks for watching. Bye.